Today I'm going to talk about a story in the Gospels in Matthew and in Luke about a centurion who comes to Jesus and asks Jesus to heal his servant. The biggest difference between Matthew and Luke concerning this story is that in Matthew, it doesn't mention any servants or any friends of the centurion who come to Jesus. And instead, it very strongly appears that the centurion comes to Jesus personally. But in Luke, first the centurion sends Jewish friends of his because he is a Gentile, and they ask Jesus if he will heal the man's servant, and they say that he has good relations with the Jewish community. And then when Jesus agrees and is on his way, the centurion sends more messengers to say, "I'm not worthy that you should come into my house, but speak the word only, and my servant will be healed." Whereas in Matthew, it appears that that is just part of a dialogue that takes place between Jesus and the centurion personally. The reason that this video is included in my mini-series on inerrancy is because, as I said in my previous video, this story about the centurion can be a kind of a gateway. I even joked and called it a gateway drug between traditional inerrancy and a compositional device view. And I think people sometimes make that shift without realizing that they are making that shift. The reasons for this are multiple. It's kind of interesting to see all the different dynamics that are taking place in the sociology, if I can put it that way, of scholars and laymen talking about this centurion incident. Here are a couple of the dynamics that go into that kind of gateway function. First of all, I'm just going to say outright, and you'll see this as I go on in the video, why I believe this. The traditional inerrantist harmonizations between Matthew and Luke on this relatively minor point of whether the centurion was personally present or not are not very convincing. They have some problems and some strain to them. And that causes people who are accepting them to maybe be looking for something else to say, something about a special literary device at the time, or something that sort of bolsters that somewhat strained harmonization that they have previously accepted, especially if you get into the text in detail. The second dynamic that's taking place on the scholarly end is an overly rigid version of what is known as the two-source hypothesis. Now, since this story is not found in Mark, the supposed source that it would have been in would be Q, which is a hypothetical source that refers to material found in Matthew and Luke, but not found in Mark. You'll notice that the minute we start talking about a source, we're getting away from the idea of real living individuals who were there, whom the authors might have talked to. When you go with an overly rigid version of this, I'm not even saying that I know that there was no document that stood in the place of Q, but when you go with an overly rigid version of this, you get this idea that, let's say in the case of a supposed Q material, Luke and Matthew couldn't have had any independent access to the facts. They were both just working with Q, and that was it, and that was their only access to what happened. This creates a problem when there's an apparent contradiction, or when there's actually additional material in one document that isn't in the other, because scholars then feel that they have to choose which author made stuff up, to put it bluntly. And I've actually seen more liberal scholars say that Luke made up the servants and the Jews who came to Jesus on the behalf of the centurion, because they maybe prefer the shorter version, and Matthew's is the shorter version, and we've got to say that somebody made stuff up. We couldn't possibly say that Luke and Matthew had actually factually different access. No, it's just them both working with Q. So then those scholars will conjecture that Q did not have the servants, and Luke made the servants up. And as someone who's a more conservative scholar, quote unquote, may feel that it's better in some sense to say that Q actually contained the servants, and then that Matthew deliberately factually changed it to make the centurion come in person, because that seems like a more modest change than inventing the Jews and the servants. You see how the scholars are getting themselves tangled up with this idea that you can't have factually different access to what happened, which might even on some matters conflict, but it's actually different witnesses. Another difference is that Matthew actually has Jesus saying more about the Gentiles, many coming from the east and the west and sitting down at the table with Abraham while the children are cast into darkness. So if you're going to make Matthew have no separate factual access, then what are we going to say? Well, that was in Q, but Luke didn't include it, but Matthew did. Or are we going to just say Matthew made it up? So we need to really watch it. When you hear somebody talk about the two-source hypothesis, prick up your ears and listen. Does he simply mean that Mark existed and some document that we could call Q existed and Matthew and Luke used them, which by itself may be benign? Or is he then going to lack them in that could be the only access to the facts that they had, no other independent access in a given story? So that's part of the dynamic. And then a third part of the dynamic that is taking place is ambiguity or confusion on the part of especially traditional inerrantists about what they're affirming if they take over the idea of a compositional device or a literary device. There's a lot of ambiguity there. Do you mean something fact-changing, or do you mean something that's not fact-changing? So let's get into this just a little bit. In Matthew, this is Matthew 8. It says, "And when he had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, entreating him, and saying, 'Sir, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering great pain.' And he," that is Jesus, "said to him, 'I will come and heal him.' But the centurion answered and said, 'Lord, I am not qualified for you to come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed.'" Now he goes on, he talks about being a man under authority, and Jesus then comments on his great faith and says he had not found such great faith not in Israel. "And I say to you that many shall come from east and west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom, but the sons of the kingdom shall be cast out," and so forth. Then verse 13, "And Jesus said to the centurion, 'Go your way, let it be done to you as you have believed,' and the servant was healed that very hour." Now, Greek is an inflected language. So when Jesus says, and it says to the centurion, "Go your way, let it be done to you," that is in the singular in the Greek. He's not speaking to a group there. Matthew is portraying him as speaking to the centurion. Now in Luke, I'm not going to read that to you, but you can look that up in Luke 7. As I said, first, the centurion sends his friends, his Jewish friends, and they say he's worthy that you should do this for him because he's built a synagogue for us, and Jesus agrees and he's coming. And then the centurion sends more servants, and they say, "No, I'm not worthy." And by the way, Jews sometimes did consider that they were defiled if they went into a Gentile's house. So it may be that the centurion was being culturally sensitive, that he didn't want Jesus to feel like he had to come into his house. If Jesus, he didn't know, maybe Jesus had that concern. So he sends that. And in Luke, Jesus comments on his faith, but somewhat more briefly. Let's find this here. "He marveled at him. I say to you, not even if in Israel have I found such great faith." And then it just ends by saying in Luke 7:10, "And when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health." So there's not that, go, etc. statement. Now, the ambiguous thing that you will hear is that this is transferral, and that in Matthew, it's just saying that Jesus interacted with the centurion, but he interacted with those the centurion had sent. And so that's kind of the same thing. And I think that what people are thinking there when they say that is that it's a little bit like if I said, "I told my daughter to clean her room, and I sent one of her sisters, because her room is downstairs, to go down and say, 'Mom says to clean your room.'" Okay, if I said, "Yeah, I told her," I said later maybe to my husband, "Yeah, I told her to clean her room," I was not personally there. I sent someone else with the message. at the most, there could be some confusion or some ambiguity as to whether I personally went down the stairs and told her. Or similarly, if I said, John is building a house out in this town. Well, in our culture, John is probably not out there with a hammer and nail, especially if I said John and Ginny, it's a couple and they're building a house. What I would mean is that they had hired contractors to do it. So there's a certain amount of ambiguity in certain expressions that we have where it's being done on our behalf by someone else. And I think people are thinking that that's all that's meant. And this is an area where I want to give credit where it's due. I've listened to 2 or 3 recordings of Dr. Michael Licona talking about this. And in this one, he actually distinguishes what he's saying from that mere figure of speech, which he calls metonymy. Now, it's possible that you just haven't heard one of those recordings, and so you get the wrong idea. But here, I have actually heard him make a clear distinction. What he calls metonymy is what I just called a figure of speech where you say, Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, for example, and Pilate isn't, personally wielding the whip, or I told my daughter to clean her room and I sent someone else with the message. From what he is advocating in that passage, which is that actually Matthew tried to make it look like the person came in, like the centurion came in person. Matthew tried to make it look like the centurion came in person. And in other words, that's not just an ambiguous expression. The idea of that compositional device is that Matthew is actually going out of his way to make it look like the centurion was there personally when he knew that the centurion was not there personally. Now, I would agree that Matthew is trying to make it look like the centurion was there personally, but I do not agree that Matthew knew to the contrary. But there is a bit of a problem with the mere figure of speech thing. One part of the problem is that it right from the beginning says the centurion came to him entreating him. And then it says that Jesus said to him. So there's definitely an appearance of the centurion being there personally. It says he came to him. And then, of course, there are the singular verbs at the end, go, let it be done. Singular verbs, and pronouns, let it be done to you as you have believed. And Jesus is clearly speaking to a single individual, not to a group of servants who have come. And that creates a problem for this idea that it's just an accidental ambiguity. What I think you would have to do if you wanted to harmonize this in a traditional way would be something a little different. It wouldn't just be good to just say, oh yeah, that's just the whole way through there. It's just kind of an accidental ambiguity, as if I said, Joe and Jenny are building a house. Instead, you would need to say that at the beginning, it's an accidental ambiguity. It's that kind of thing. The centurion came to him, but it's really his friends who came to him. But then that by the time you get to the end, the centurion has become curious about what is going to happen after sending these different messengers. And he has come personally, and he's standing there, and Jesus looks up and sees him, recognizes that he is personally there, and says individually to him, go, let it be unto you as you have believed. So that he's speaking to the centurion in different ways at different points in the passage. I think that's the best traditional harmonization to go with. I myself find that unconvincing because in Matthew, it really is smooth. It really appears that he's speaking to the centurion the same way all the way through. And it would be very odd for Matthew to know that the centurion wasn't there personally and portray it in this way. He came to him, but it wasn't really him. And then at the end, the centurion was there personally, and he said to him, go, without any explanation to that effect. I think that is strained. And probably this is why Dr. Licona and some others have concluded that no, Matthew knew that the centurion was not there personally, but maybe because he read it in Q, right? But he deliberately portrayed it as the centurion coming there personally. They would say to shorten it. Notice, by the way, that that's not necessary to shorten it. There would be ways that he could write this that would be less clear in their appearance that the centurion is there, but would be shorter. You could even mention the emissaries briefly, and he sent some to him, and they asked him to come. They wouldn't have to go into the whole big thing about he's built a synagogue. They asked him to heal him. Jesus said, I will come, but he sent others to him saying, I am not worthy. And Jesus said this, and I mean that's not going to take significantly more words. And indeed, if Matthew's goal was to shorten, he would have cut the extra bit about many coming from the east and from the west. There's not a consistent shortening tendency here. So that's something to be alert for, that sometimes you'll hear, oh, he had to change the facts because he had to shorten it. No, you never have to change the facts to shorten something. And so he wanted to shorten is not actually a sufficient motive for changing the facts and like making the centurion come in person. My own guess is that this is a good faith error. Whether because Matthew had not been called yet as a disciple, there's some ambiguity in the chronology between Matthew, Luke, and Mark on that question, or whether because he just, he went out for a coffee then and he didn't happen to be there when this event happened. I'm guessing that Matthew was not present on this occasion. And I'm not tying Matthew to Q as his only source of information. So let us imagine that Matthew talked to someone else who was there. Now, I've had an online discussion where the other person talking with me said, well, that just pushes it back then. The person Matthew talked to, I guess he faked it, made it look, he used the word fake, but made it look like the centurion was there in person. No, not necessarily. Because we don't have what that person said. This is a conjecture on my part. We can imagine that that person actually did just leave out the emissaries. Maybe that person said, when Jesus came to Capernaum, a centurion asked him to heal his servant, but without the statement came to him and treated him, right? And Jesus said, I will come. But the centurion told him, or the centurion said just some bland word like that, but not, Jesus said to him. The centurion came to him, okay? The centurion said, I am not worthy, etc. And Jesus said this. Maybe that person was even most interested in Jesus' remarkable words about many coming from the east and from the west, and kind of moved past the earlier part to get to that and tell what Jesus had said there. And then just said something like, and Jesus said, he is healed, or I agree, or even in the plural, go, let it be unto you as you have believed. And then when Matthew heard it, because he incorrectly interpreted the earlier part as meaning that centurion was there personally, he just figured the plural go, maybe the centurion came with other people or something like that. And the centurion and these other people were there, and that's why it's plural. And that's a genuine paraphrase, trivial, recognizable paraphrase. Changed it to go in the singular, but not trying to give an impression contrary to fact, because he genuinely had misunderstood and believed that the centurion was there in person. Now, is that incompatible with inerrancy? Absolutely. Absolutely, because I think inerrancy should be kept to traditional inerrancy, but it is also completely incompatible with inerrancy to say that Matthew changed it and made the centurion come in person when he knew the centurion wasn't there. And as my previous video discussed, that's going to have a greater effect upon reliability. In fact, when you give it this name transferral, which Dr. Lacona does, and you say, well, it was just accepted at the time to make it look like someone was there who wasn't there, then there's no reason to restrict it to cases of messengers. For example, Dr. Lacona says that the author of John, that John transferred the phrase, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, to the mouth of John the Baptist. It's not even from another person. It's from the beginning of the Gospel of Mark. In other words, he invented that John the Baptist said this. He suggests that. He says it's impossible to know. So there's transferal where you don't even have a message relationship between the two. It's just John making up that John the Baptist said this. In the Roman examples, he claims that the Roman historian Plutarch transferred something about Caesar from one person to another, and it's not a message. It's not one of them acting as the other's messenger. It's just apparently Plutarch woke up that morning and said, hey, I think I'll have this guy say it instead of that guy. I think that's implausible that Plutarch did that either, but you see how that's not limited in that case to things that are really trivial. So it does have a much wider effect upon reliability, and it is not compatible with your inerrancy either. So if you're going to go with one of these harmonizations where it's just Matthew kind of accidentally speaking ambiguously, even though he knows that the centurion wasn't there, and then we're just like misunderstanding it, you need to know, don't say, well, this is a compositional device at the time, and Dr. Michael Lacona has found that this was something that was done, because what he's talking about is not what you're talking about. And I'm not even saying here that he's been totally unclear on this. Sometimes he's been quite clear and he's laid out the different options. You're talking about what he calls metonymy, and he's talking about what he calls transferral, where it's a transferal and the person is actually making someone say something that was not said by that person. So you should not refer to that, or you're going to confuse people. Now, you may say, well, what do I gain? They're both incompatible with inerrancy. Well, watch my last video on that. But let me also say that I've factually investigated, and please get hold of the Mirror of the Mask if you're interested. And I cannot find any evidence in Greco-Roman literature of a device where you were allowed to make it seem like somebody was present and go into all kinds of detail, like, he came to him and Jesus said to him in the singular, when you knew the person wasn't there. And the audiences just kind of went in saying, oh, well, it looks like somebody was there, but maybe he wasn't really there because there's this device. There isn't evidence for that. Okay, one of the examples brought as evidence for that is this inductive method from Plutarch, where in one story about the Senate, kind of boring Senate discussion of Caesar, one senator insults Caesar in a certain way, and in another one around the same time, another senator insults Caesar in the same way. Well, have you ever heard of talking points? These guys were all opposed to Caesar. There's no reason to think that Plutarch transferred it. And there's no reference in the exercise books to, you're allowed to make it look like one guy said it when you're writing history, even though it was really a different guy who said it. It's just out there. So factually speaking, an actual device where you change who said it is not factually supported. Nor is it factually supported that the gospel authors would have used such a device if there was one. And this is all to the good, because we would rather have gospel authors who are at least trying to tell what really happened than ones who are trying to change the facts in an invisible fashion, which would have a fairly broad effect upon the reliability of the documents. So not only would this have a worse effect on the reliability of the documents than a good faith error, but a good faith error is more probable, because we could see how that could happen. And I've just given you kind of a scenario in which that could actually quite easily happen, just a misunderstanding between Matthew and his human source. But we don't have evidence of this very deliberate activity of changing it, and of audiences just lowering their expectations of literal accuracy. So that's what I think the evidence supports more. If, however, you want to stick with a traditional harmonization, I would suggest you would stick with the one where the Centurion comes later and it's ambiguous earlier in the passage. And I would suggest that you not refer to this as a literary or compositional device of the time, because you don't want to lead your audience to be open to the idea of the author changing the facts in an invisible way, assuming that that isn't something you are actually prepared to embrace with its departure from your traditional inerrancy. It's interesting to notice that I'm the only one that I am aware of who accepts this idea about a good faith error on Matthew's part. That does not bother me. In one of his videos where he discusses this, Dr. Lacona says, I don't know of any other scholar who accepts this view. And he says that as if it's a problem, as if it should mean that there is something wrong with my view. I don't know of any scholar who accepts this view. But from my perspective, it's a question of where does the evidence point? And I am utterly unmoved by the statement that nobody knows of any other scholar who accepts this view, that Matthew made a good faith error. My own suspicion is that there are so few scholars who draw that conclusion because there's a kind of persistent ambiguity between the fact-changing and the non-fact-changing versions of Matthew's transferring things to the servants, and also because not enough scholars go into the detail to say this is why the non-fact changing transferral view, that metonymy view, is somewhat strained. Once we recognize that, then I think that kind of pushes us in one direction or other. In the next video, I am probably going to be talking about why I am not an inerrantist. And I want to emphasize that I am not doing this to be a missionary for errancy. That's not a goal of mine. I'm doing it because I think people are interested in that topic. And I think it's better to have things out in the open. And I do get emails where people ask that question. But I have a much larger goal, as I hope these videos have made it clear, to argue that the facts do not support deliberate alteration of facts on the part of the gospel authors. That is, I think the facts support the idea that they never deliberately changed any facts at all. And I've tried to go into that in a lot of detail in The Mirror of the Mask and The Eye of the Beholder. So I hope you'll follow up on that. But if you're interested in the topic of inerrancy and you wanted to ask, why are you not an inerrantist? I'm going to try to address that next time. Please come back to this channel where we're making common sense rigorous.